Welcome to part 4 of the Roaring Twenties, American Consumerism. Now, like I mentioned before, during the 1920s, this time period of the Roaring Twenties is known as Coolidge prosperity. It's named after the president who presided over a good deal of it. It is important to note out that the Roaring Twenties, though, were not roaring for everyone. Here's an interesting piece of statistics for you. Of the wealth in the world after World War I, the United States possessed 40% of it. So they possessed a lion's share of the global wealth. But of that wealth in the United States, the top 1% controlled 24% of it. The next 9% controlled 26% of it. So that means half of the U.S. wealth was controlled by the top 10% of Americans. The bottom 60% of Americans controlled only 5% of the wealth. So when we talk about the consumerism of the 1920s, we need to realize that 60% of Americans that only control 5% of the wealth, they didn't have a roaring 20s. When we talk about the Great Depression, we'll really see this. I mean, if you ask a farmer when the Great Depression started, he's going to tell you 1921, right? But this is a time period of a great deal of consumerism. You see a lot of advertising like this great one you see here on the screen for a Gillette razor, so safe that why not lather up your baby and give him a razor blade, right? Things that are not necessities like Coca-Cola, though I know some people would argue that that is a necessity. There'll be campaigns like the Truth in Advertising campaign, the American Thrift campaign, right? Which will lead to things like, labels like what you see on the one-night cough syrup there, which definitely will take care of your cough. It has alcohol, cannabis, chloroform, and morphine in it. And, think about it. You can't cough when you're in a coma, right? But you really see consumerism at its best during this time period when you take a look at the automobile industry. In 1903, a 40-year-old man named Henry Ford quit his job. He decided that he was going to start his own car company. Now, in order to do that, he had to get financial backing. He had to convince people to invest in his startup company. How did he do that? Well, he built a prototype. Now, it's not the one you're thinking about. It's not the Model T. That comes later. He builds a race car. Remember, cars at this point in time are very new. In 1900, there's only 8,000 cars in the United States. They're all east of the Mississippi River. They're expensive, right? The roads are limited. So he begins by building this race car. It works. He gets $28,000 in financial backing, allowing him to create Ford Motor Company. Now he goes about creating a car for production. And after going through several iterations, he settles on that Model T. Now, the Model T is not fancy. It's got not a lot of bells and whistles, not a lot of extras. They're all the same. Henry Ford himself will say you can get it in any color you want as long as it's black. Right? Now, in the process of building these cars, what he wants to do is he wants to make a car that's simple and cheap. And in the process of doing this, he's going to perfect the assembly line. He's going to create what's known as the dynamic principles of mass production. Right? Remember, Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. He just perfected it. He wanted to make these cars as cheap as possible. So what do? You create an assembly line where the car is just moving down the conveyor. And you got an employee. His job is left front fenders. He's got the conveyor with the cars going in front of him. He's got another conveyor behind him with left front fenders. And all day long, grabs fender, puts fender on. Grabs fender, puts fender on. Right? That allows you to mass produce these cars at a real cheap cost. For example, 1909, the Model T cost only $950, which was really cheap during that time period. The average car at this time cost more than twice that. Okay, but by 1913, he had the cost down to $290. By 1924, the cost was down to $250. Did this work? Yeah, it did. In 1909, he sold 18,000 cars. In 1924, he sold 1.25 million cars. Matter of fact, by 1920, there were more Ford Model Ts on American roads than there were bathtubs in people's houses. The cars outnumbered the bathtubs, right? He changed how employees were paid, right? The average auto worker made $2.40 a day. He gave $5 a day to his employees. This way they could afford to buy his cars. What better advertisement for your vehicle than to have the factory's parking lot filled with these Model Ts? Okay. Now, he's not going to be the only car manufacturer, though. And one of his main rivals is actually going to take a different tactic that is so good that even Henry Ford eventually will have to adopt it. General Motors is going to be a different type of car company than what Henry Ford has come up with, right? Was created by a group of men that began going around and buying up the small car companies in the region, right? Cars like companies like Chevrolet and Oldsmobile and Cadillac and Pontiac, right? They began to gather them all under one umbrella. When General Motors came under the control of Alfred Sloan, he began to develop General Motors into another powerhouse automobile company in the United States. He looked at it differently than Henry Ford, though. It was Alfred Sloan's opinion that the American public had already fallen in love with the automobile. And that's a pretty safe statement. I mean, we take a look at America today. I would say America still really loves their cars, especially when you compare it to like Europe and other places. For example, how many of you out there, either yourself or know somebody who's named their car? Why would you name your car? You've given an agency by doing this. Well, it's because we love our cars, right? And so he knows that people will pay for the prestige that the car brings them. They'll pay for it, even if they can't afford it. So one of the things he's going to introduce is auto financing. You can't quite pay for this car? Well, you can just get a loan from us, and then you can just make installment payments so you can keep up with the Joneses, who maybe they got a nice car now too. Right? The other thing that he creates is planned obsolescence. There's two tiers to this and what he develops. First of all, he wants to make sure that you desire buying a new car every year. How do you do that? You add features to it. Each year it has some kind of new thing. If you take a look at the picture here, that new model of the Oldsmobile Old Scout has got the new horn. I know it's one of the little, type horns, but still, right? Maybe next year it'll have the windshield kind of thing. Each year, some kind of new gimmick to make it desirable. And, remember, if your neighbor gets one of those, you're going to want one too. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is levels of prestige. Since General Motors has several little car companies under its banner, it can create levels of prestige. Chevrolet is your entry-level car. But maybe you do really well. Now I can afford to get the Pontiac. Oh, I became a supervisor. I can buy an Oldsmobile. I'm a manager. I can finally buy the Cadillac. This still works today, right? If you take a look at a basic Chevy Yukon and a Cadillac Escalade, the primary difference is the emblem on the front, right? They are basically both the same cars. Needless to say, with the Cadillac, you have more options and features to it and stuff. But if you've got a fully loaded Yukon and a base model Escalade, there's very little difference between the two. Right? This works so well that finally, by 1928, even Henry Ford has to abandon the Model T and adopt this new process.